guys, hope you're having a good week. Today I'll be sharing my first union talk ever this year in our series Johannine Signs. So before I begin, I just wanted to touch on what Johannine Signs are, because if you're anything like me, I didn't actually know what Johannine Signs were before we began this series. So if it's your first time here, I just want to touch on that. So Johannine Signs are also known as the 7 signs of John's Gospel, or the miracles of Jesus in the chapter of John. We wanted to do this series because I think so often we kind of hear about the miracles of Jesus and we kind of just take them for surface level things. So we wanted to just dive into them a bit deeper and look at the symbolism and meaning behind the things that Jesus did. So far we've done turning water into wine, and last week we did the healings of Jesus. So if you want to watch those videos first, feel free to, because my story is going to carry on right after those two. Otherwise, let's start reading. The chapter I'm going to unpack is John chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. And just a disclaimer, the more I read this chapter, the more things I realized I could have said. And that's why I just encourage you to read it for yourself, if it's just this section or maybe even the whole of John, just because there's so much to say, and I think just allowing God to speak to you in your situation, how these things could be relevant to you, is so important. So yeah, I just encourage you to read it for yourself. Otherwise, I'm just going to share the things that stood out for me and will hopefully be useful to you as well. So, taking a look at verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with the disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So those are just the first 3 verses. And the basic idea we get is that Jesus just performed this miraculous act of healing, and now people are following him. And not just a few people, like 10 or 20, but 5,000 people following him. Actually, no, that's a lie. There were 5,000 men following him, meaning that, including the women and the children, Bible scholars believe there could have been around 15 to 20,000 people following Jesus, which is a humongous amount. I looked it up, and that's about a third of Cape Town Stadium. I'm not sure how big Matthew Mole's concert was, but it might have been as big as that. It was a lot of people. The interesting thing is that not all of these people were actually interested in Jesus as the Son of God. A lot of them needed healing themselves. A lot of them were simply fascinated by the things he had done. A lot of them were simply following the crowd. Many of them were hungry but couldn't fulfill that hunger. And later on, Jesus mentions that the people here were more interested in the material things he could offer them than the spiritual things. And I think that's such a good indication and such a good picture of how there can be thousands of people, and they're all needy in a broken world. And what they truly need could be right in front of them, but they don't see that, and they chase after the wrong things. So anyway, let's move on to what happens next. So moving on to verses 5 to 9, I'll start reading them. When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Okay. So in these verses, we get a glimpse of how the disciples were thinking about the whole situation. How do you feed 20,000 people when you don't have any food in the first place? In the book of Mark, the disciples' solution was to send the people away to buy their own food, which seems like a fairly logical solution. But Jesus insists, the disciples must be the one to feed these people. And so he asks Philip, "What's your solution?" Now, considering everything Philip has seen being Jesus' disciple, he's seen water being turned into wine. He's seen lame men walk. He's seen healings. He's seen miracles. You would expect him to say to the Lord, like, surely you can feed these 5,000 people, Lord. But that's not actually what he says. He tries to calculate things, and he says it would take more than half a year's wages just so each person would have a bite. And even if they did have that money, it's not like there was just like a shop down the road that had enough bread to feed 20,000 people. And I think we can find ourselves in the same situation Philip was in a lot of the time, where if we're in an unlikely situation, we tend to think of things through human reasoning. We tend to kind of think of the numbers and all that. And although there's nothing wrong with that, if we exclude God from the equation, I think then that's when we might be doing something wrong, because we should never forget that although things might be impossible for us, they're not impossible for God. And, he can do all things even when we cannot, or even when the odds aren't in our favor. So let's move on to Andrew. So he's like, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. But how will they be able to feed 20,000 people? I'm not sure why Andrew even bothered to bring this food to Jesus, if he was maybe he just felt like, at least it's something. And in these days, barley loaves were actually the size of flapjacks. They were very small. Barley was the kind of food that poor people ate or animals ate. And judging by that, the fish were probably small too. He was almost seemed to reflect a bit of an embarrassment over the size of the lunch. And I think this is really just a good outline of sometimes there's a huge need, sometimes there's a huge task you need to do, but the resources you have are very little. And in your own strength, you're never going to be able to do this task, or you're never going to have enough of what you need to perform a specific thing. And basically, humans have needs, but are not always able to meet those needs in their own strength. So, moving on, let's just say that Jesus was really patient, and although he was testing them, I think he was only doing it to see if they would trust him more. Because in the end, he already knew what he was going to do. He's in control. He knows how he wants to handle the situation. So let's read on to the next few verses. Verse 10 to 13. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Okay. There's a lot to say about this section, but one thing that really strikes me is that the Lord chose to feed all 20,000 people, and he didn't leave anyone out. If you look back on what the disciples' solution was, they were just let's just send the people out to buy their own food. But the Lord was like, no, I want to feed these people. He had compassion on them. And if you think about it, I could have been one of those 20,000. In fact, I'm one of billions of people. You're one of billions of people. But the Lord would go through the miraculous just to do something so simple, like feed us, to care for us, to show us love. He would go through so much when he could just ignore us. He doesn't. And it's not like he performed an interview with each person to find out whether he liked them or not. He literally just gave what he had to everybody who would receive it. And if you haven't kind of figured it out by now, we kind of have to realize that this whole story can also be seen as a metaphor to the bread of life. It isn't just a story about feeding hungry stomachs, but it's also about the spiritual satisfaction that only Jesus can bring. And when we come with that, from that angle, that bread will never run out. Just as in the story, there were even baskets left over of bread, and the people couldn't even finish it because there was just so much. In John chapter 6, verse 35, God says, "I am the bread of life, and he who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst." So we can eat as much as we want, but there would still be left over. The second big thing that strikes me is a rather obvious one. Like, how in the world did God use one boy's lunch to feed thousands of people? It wasn't even like a normal lunch. It was mere barley. It was like kind of a more poorer, cheap lunch. And it didn't even belong to an adult. It belonged to a kid. It's like, I don't think there was a smaller lunch out there. But I think that was on purpose, because it can show that, like, even if you're young and even if you don't have much, God can still use you for really powerful things. Because it's not about like how much you can do or if you're adequate enough. It's about just giving what you have to the Lord, with, even if it's very little, and letting him multiply that and use that for his kingdom. And I think that's so epic, because you're not limited to your own ability. You're only limited by God's ability, and that's not very limited. So be encouraged that, like, even if you feel like you don't have much, or you don't have many talents or many gifts or anything like that, just offer what you have to the Lord, because just like a tiny thing could be so humongous. It could be used for humongous things. It's also cool how in the beginning of this chapter, like, the Lord could have sent bread from heaven, or he could have not asked the disciples, but he chose to include the disciples. He chose to ask them questions. He wants to involve people in what he's doing, even though he doesn't need people to be involved in what he's doing. That's also just a really cool thing to remember, that God can use ordinary people for extraordinary things, and that he wants to use people, even though he doesn't need to. Anyway, let's move on to the last part of this section. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. You might be thinking, like, why did Jesus leave? And that's answered later in the chapter, when he says, these people were following him because they ate their fill of bread, when they should have been focused on the food that endures to eternal life. And I think even today, there are people who are following Jesus, but they have that mindset of, if you follow God, you'll be happy, you'll have a nice house, you'll be successful. Almost in other words, if you follow God, you'll have bread, and you'll have lots of bread, because God provides bread. And I think in a way, or actually in a big way, like, that mindset is so sad, because God's not just some sort of chef that provides material things. He's so much more than that, and he can offer so much more than that. And I think we just always need to remember that the thing we should be seeking most is simply just a true relationship with God. And out of that, everything we need will be provided in God's perfect will and timing. So, in conclusion, this Johannine sign, as well as all the others we've covered so far, were recorded for a particular purpose, which were so that you would believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life in his name. So I hope this section of John was encouraging for you, just like it was for people all those years ago. Have a good week, and bye!